When Andrew was in the Marine Corps, we had talked, and he had said that there was somebody that he would like me to write a letter to explain about who Jesus was, or to explain to him about Jesus. And so I sat down and I put together a letter addressed to somebody I did not know, and tried to explain to him about who God was and why Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was so important. Going from the perspective that this person might have absolutely no understanding of who Jesus was. And I think there's this, for those of us who have been around Christianity a long time, we have this assumption that everybody kind of knows who he is and kind of what the deal is. And so it was a very interesting exercise for me to try and explain what Christianity is all about from the perspective of perhaps this guy not knowing anything about Christianity at all. And so for just a minute, just a second or two here, I'd like you to think about someone has come up to you and they've asked you about Jesus. They have no idea who this guy is, and they want to know what the deal is. What would you say to them? How would you describe Jesus? Why would you say that baptism is important, or the communion is important? How would you explain those things to that person? Kind of interesting, isn't it? Because we don't usually think about that at all. And yet, as Christian people, we're called to be willing to share the faith that lies within us. Someone who doesn't really understand Christianity might say, well, what is the big deal anyway? Everybody talks about God being this loving God. Why doesn't he just let everybody into heaven? Well, you have to understand God's character, and you have to understand God's nature. Chad loves sports, and he's a pretty big Chicago Bears fan. And so I would say if we talk to Chad and the Vikings are playing the Chicago Bears, and we encourage Chad to cheer on the Vikings, his response is going to be, not going to happen. Can't make me do it, right? Because being a Chicago Bears fan is just ingrained in who he is. It's part of his nature, right? And so to have him cheer for somebody who never wins like the Vikings, it's just not probably going to happen, right? Well, there are things about God's nature and character that are a part of who he is, and they just don't change. So God is a holy God, and he is a loving God, and he is a just God. We like to think that we are just people, that we do the right thing. But there are times when we ignore our justice to embrace another part of our character. Maybe it was a time when your child did something that was wrong, but they just were so cute, you just couldn't hardly keep from laughing. Right? I shouldn't tell stories on my wife, but I'm going to. When she was really little, she got into trouble, and she knew she was going to get a spanking. And so she went upstairs, and she put on every single pair of panties and everything that she could to pad up her bottom before she went down to see her dad, right? And I imagine that her dad had a very hard time giving her a spanking because, he just wanted to laugh, right? Because it was so cute. Well, God has to always be true to himself, or he wouldn't be God. So God can't embrace his love and ignore his justice. God has to be both just and loving. And he can't choose one or the other. And that's the whole reason Jesus had to come to earth and die on the cross, because God loved us and he wanted to spend eternity with us, but somebody had to pay the price for our sins. justice had to be met. And so someone who is not guilty paid the price for those of us who were guilty. It allowed God to be true to his justice, and it allowed God to be true to his love. This morning, we're going to look at a story that is from the Old Testament. It's a little obscure, but it's interesting because it gives us some insight into God's character, about this idea about God being unchanging and always true to himself. So turn with me, if you will, to 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. I'm going to read from the New International Version. And it says this: During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, "It's on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." The king summoned David, King David summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. David asked the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? How can I make this right? How shall I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites answered him, "We have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death. What do you want me to do for you?" David asked. They answered the king, "As for the man who destroyed us and plotted against us, so that we have been decimated and have no place anywhere to go, or no place anywhere in Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed and exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one." So the king said, "I will give them to you." And we're going to skip ahead there to verse 9. He handed them over to the Gibeonites, who killed and exposed them on a hill before the Lord. All 7 of them fell together. They were put to death during the first days of the harvest, just as the barley harvest was beginning. So, if you remember your Bible history, when the Israelites left Egypt, right? God delivered them from Egypt with Moses, and they crossed the Red Sea, and you have all those 10 plagues and stuff that is going on there. And they wander in the wilderness, and as they come into the promised land, Joshua is now leading the people, and they have several victories. And the Amorites, or the Gibeonites, they see all of these other kings that have fallen to the Israelite people, and they're saying, "Well, that's not going to work." And so they said, "Well, if outright strength won't work, maybe guile will. We'll trick them." And so they took worn out clothes and worn out sandals, and they took moldy bread, and they prepared it, and they came to the leaders of Israel, and they said to them, "When we left, our clothes were brand new, and this bread was fresh out of the oven. Look at it now. We're from far, far, far away, so make this peace agreement with us." And the Bible, almost as a parenthetical note, says that no one bothered to ask the Lord about what was going on. And I'm sure these religious leaders are like, "Wow, we must be really special. I mean, they're from way far away and they've heard about us. Yeah, let's do this deal." Right? And so they make this peace pact with the Gibeonite people, and then a few days later find out that they're their neighbors. Well, that didn't go so well. And the Israelites are angry and they're upset. But Joshua said, "You know, we made this deal with them. We have to abide by it." And to make matters worse, when all of the other surrounding Amorites and Canaanite people realized that the Gibeonites had made a peace treaty with Israel, they're like, okay, we'll take you out. And so they go to attack the Gibeonite people, and the Gibeonites send people back to Israel and say, hey, remember this peace treaty that you made with us? We need you to honor it because these guys are going to kick the snot out of us, right? And it would have been easy for Israel to just, turn their head and say, yeah, we screwed up on this one. We'll just ignore what's going on and our problem will go away. But that's not what happened, right? Joshua took soldiers and they went to defend the Gibeonite people. And one of the greatest battles in the Old Testament history is recorded because of what they did, right? God held them to their agreement even though it was done in deception. Well, now let's fast forward. And lots of years have gone by. We've gone through Samuel and the prophets. And Saul has been king. And Saul sees that his people like it when he goes out and he beats up on these Canaanite people. So he goes out to destroy the Gibeonite people. But remember, they had an agreement years ago, a peace agreement, right? Saul does it anyway. And then Saul dies. He's killed in battle. And David becomes king. And they start to have these famines. The rains aren't coming for 3 years in a row. And when David asks God why that's happening through the priesthood, God's response is, well, it's because of what Saul did. This morning, there are 5 things, we'll have to go quickly to get them all in here, that we can see in this passage that give us insight into God's character. The first is this: Saul broke the oath that Israel had made. Saul broke the oath that Israel had made. Let me read 2 Samuel 21, verses 1 and 2 again. During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said, it's on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death. The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them. But Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. So Saul broke the oath that Joshua and his people had made with the Gibeonite people. And, there's questions that come to mind. Well, why didn't God do something right away? We don't know. I mean, at this point, Saul is dead. We don't know how many years it's into David's reign. David reigned like 40 years, but, suddenly we have these problems, and they stem back to something that happened years before. The second thing that we can see is that God takes our oaths seriously. In Joshua 9, we can see where this treaty took place. Joshua 9, 16 through 19. It says, 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors living near them. So the Israelites set out, and on the 3rd day came to their cities. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the assembly had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The whole assembly grumbled against the leaders, but all the leaders answered, we've given them our oath by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them now. So not only had they agreed to protect them, but they made it an oath in God's name. Right? Now, do you remember what God had told the Israelite people? That when they came into the land, they were to destroy the inhabitants completely, utterly. It was God's judgment for 400 years of wickedness. When Abraham was in Ur, right? And God told Abraham, I want you to leave. I want you to go to this place that I will show you. And Abraham packs up and he leaves Ur, and he goes and he spends the rest of his life living in a tent. And he is in Canaan. He's in the land that God is one day going to give to the Israelite people. What is Palestine today, right? And God says to him, I'm going to give this to you, but not yet, because their iniquity is not full. In other words, God said, someday this land is going to be an inheritance for your descendants, but I'm not ready to give it to you yet, because these people haven't sinned to the point that I'm ready to judge them. Make sense? 400 years later, God's ready. And their sin and their wickedness was pretty bad stuff, right? So they worshiped the Ashereth. They worshiped Moloch. The Ashereth was a fertility goddess, and they would engage in all kinds of sexual acts. And then the children that were born, the babies that were born out of these acts, would be offered as a sacrifice, and then they would be buried by the Asherah pole. Well, certainly God doesn't approve of that. And then they worship Moloch. And Moloch was like this statue with his arms like this. And the children that were born out of, the sinfulness of that behavior, this idol, this Moloch, had a cavity in his belly, and his arms would be out like this. They would build a fire in the belly of this statue, lay the baby on the arms, and they would roll into the fire to be consumed. Pretty horrible stuff. Is it any wonder that God said, I don't want you to have any part of any of these people at all? Because he knew that they would lead them into sin. And so God said, I want you to go in there, I want you to destroy all of those people. And then they turn around and they make this covenant, this agreement with the Gibeonite people. You would have thought that God would have said, don't do that, right? Because I already told you to kill all these guys. But God took the oath that they made so seriously that he held them to it, in spite of what he initially told them. He held them to it even years later when Saul tried to annihilate the Gibeonite people. That should give us an idea how seriously God takes the things that we say and the oaths that we say. In 2 Timothy 2, 11 through 13, it says this, if we died with him, it goes and says, this teaching is true. If we died with him, we will also live with him. If we accept suffering, we will also rule with him. If we refuse to accept him, he will refuse to accept us. If we are not faithful, God will still be faithful, because he cannot be false to himself. This is, I think, one of those sayings that they memorized in the early church, because it helped them as they shared their faith, right? But the part that I've underlined is the part that I really wanted to look at. If we are not faithful, God will still be faithful, because he cannot be false to himself. God takes the things and the oaths that we make very, very seriously. And he held Israel to it even when they had forgotten about it. Thirdly, God punished Israel for what Saul had done. God punished Israel for what Saul had done. 2 Samuel 21:1, during the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, it is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death. Not only did Saul's family suffer, But all of Israel suffered because of Saul's sin. Because what Saul had done. If that is true, then is it possible that our sinful behavior could affect not just us, but maybe our entire church? Could it go beyond just me? Remember Achan in the Old Testament? Joshua, they go into Jericho and they defeat Jericho, and God said, you're not to take anything, it's all to be dedicated to the Lord. Not supposed to take anything. And Achan sees this beautiful Babylonian robe and some wedges of gold and silver, and he takes that stuff and he buries it under his tent. Nobody saw anything, right? I'm in the clear. Except he wasn't. Because then when they went to go battle Ai, they were defeated. And God said it's because there's sin in the camp. Somebody has taken things that they weren't supposed to take. Because of Saul's sin, all of Israel suffered famine. Not for 1 year, not for 2 years, not for 3 years. If David hadn't done anything, how many years would it have continued? We don't know. It's also interesting, and this is point number 4, that God didn't relent until restitution was made. God didn't relent until it had been made right. In 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 11 through 14, it says this: When David was told what Aiah's daughter, Rizpah, Saul's concubine, had done, he went and took the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the citizens of Jabesh Gilead. They had taken them secretly from the public square in Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them after they struck down Saul on Gilboa. David brought the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from there, and the bones of those who had been killed and exposed were gathered up. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the tomb of Saul's father, Kish, at Zelah in Benjamin, and did everything the king commanded. After that, God answered prayer in behalf of the land. So, for those of you that don't remember, Saul and Jonathan are killed in battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines put them on display, their dead bodies on display. And so some brave men of Israel from Jabesh Gilead sneak in and they take the bodies of Saul and Jonathan down and return them to Israel. But after that, apparently nothing has really been done with their bodies. Right? So what happens is David finds 7 male descendants of Saul, and he turns them over to the Gibeonites, and they're hung for what Saul did in trying to destroy an entire group of people, right? The Gibeonite people. And the Gibeonites just leave them there on display. Well, Aiah's daughter, Rizpah, when she finds out, she goes and she remains with these 7 bodies, and she will not allow birds to peck on them. She won't allow wild animals anywhere near them. She can't take the bodies down, but she is protecting the bodies, And so when David hears about that, it moves him to action. And so he has those bodies taken down, those 7 bodies taken down and taken care of. And then he goes and gets Jonathan and Saul's bodies, and has them buried, which was the tradition of the people of Israel in that day, to be buried in the family tomb. That was the tradition. And when that was all finished and accomplished, God finally relented. See, God doesn't change. He is this just God. And when we say something, He expects us to do it. He holds us to it. And that leads me to my final point this morning, that we need to take the things that we say, our oaths and our vows, seriously. If God forced the Israelite people to uphold an oath that was made in deceit, right? I mean, the Gibeonites actively deceived the Israelite people, and God still held them to that. How do you suppose God feels about the things that we say that we'll do? The oaths and the vows that we make. In Matthew 5, 34 through 37, it says this: "But I tell you, never swear an oath. Don't swear an oath using the name of heaven, because heaven is God's throne. Don't swear an oath using the name of the earth, because the earth belongs to God. Don't swear an oath using the name of Jerusalem, because it is the city of the great king. Don't even swear by your own head, because you cannot make one hair on your head become white or black. Say only yes if you mean yes, and no if you mean no. If you say more than yes or no, it is from the evil one." Jesus there is the one who's actually speaking in Matthew chapter 5, and he says, be careful about the things that you say, because God will hold you to it. Be careful. You know, Chad will always be a Chicago Bears fan. That's who he is. That's part of his nature. God will always be who He is. He is a loving God, but He is also a just God. And His justice will be met. It will. It will either be met by Jesus and His sacrifice on the cross, or you will have to answer for your sins. I don't know about you, but I want Jesus.